أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة الحجة بن الحسن العسكري، فداه أرواح العالمين. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. اللهم وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته وعونه ودعاءه وخيره ورضاه، ما ننال به سعة من رحمتك وفوزا عندك يا كريم. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What is it that makes this specific commemoration, that of Fatemiyah, so critical and pivotal in our faith? How is this event connected to the problems that we observe around the Muslim world? Why is it that the Islamic world is in such disarray? Why the chaos? Why the mayhem? Why the carnage? Why do we see so much political instability, despite the fact that it's been a long time since the Holy Prophet of Islam was laid to rest in his grave? So many different political systems, forms of governance have been tried and tested, and yet here we are. Absolute pandemonium, chaos of the highest caliber, situations that drive people to the point of destitution and hopelessness. When you speak to people from the Muslim world, whether it's in the east or the west, the north, the south, it doesn't matter. The national borders are irrelevant. The name of the country is beyond discussion. But when you speak to the youth, there's a consistent theme, and it's hopelessness. The idea that things cannot get any better. We've tried everything. We've revolted. We've risen up. We've fought, we've spilled blood, we've done so much, and yet here we are. Why? It is our belief that Fatemiyah and the events that transpired in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Rasulullah are connected directly to the tragedies that we face today. When Muslim academics, people who actually care about the welfare of the nation and have sought a solution to these problems, answers to these questions, when they engage in research in an attempt to explore the problems that we face in this day and age, those of them who have a keen eye for the truth, who have astute minds and put in the effort, often trace these problems back to dynastic rule. Meaning, they say that the origin of the problems in the Muslim world, if we're being honest with ourselves, go back to the time of hereditary succession. Specifically, they zoom in on Yazid. I'm sure you've heard that, especially when you speak to members of other denominations and sects. They will almost unanimously say that the problems began with who? With Yazid. And they'll make certain citations, which I'll get to, as evidence presented to support the case that it was Yazid who represents the origin and the starting point of the pandemonium that we're experiencing today. Abdul Razzaq al-Sanhuri is an Egyptian statesman, politician, and an extremely influential academic. 19th century scholar. And I say he's influential because his works inspired many of the literature that was produced later on by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. His legal work, his academic research contributed to the establishment of the modern Arab secular state, and he was extremely influential on so many other levels. His PhD dissertation, his thesis, is entitled Fiqhul Khilafah. Bear with me, it might get a little technical, but these are very important introductions that we need to set the stage so that even you and I can begin to make sense of why is it that we are in the state that we're in right now. The discord, the fights, the conflicts, the bloodshed. Fiqhul Khilafah, the jurisprudence of Islamic succession. It's a PhD thesis, so it has to be objective and has to abide by certain academic standards. And yet, when you read this thesis, and I read through about half of it just a couple of days ago, it is riddled with inconsistencies. For instance, I'll give you a few examples. Number one, he says, what are the conditions and prerequisites for a Khalifa? He says, number one, there are technical prerequisites. Number one, the Khalifa has to be male. Number two, he has to be able-bodied, so he can't be disabled. By the way, none of these things are easily established through the Quran or Sunnah. These are deductions made and suppositions. Or, most likely, they're based on historical records. In other words, he bases this on the individuals who are characterized as khulafa. He has to be able-bodied. For what exact reason? I have no idea. He has to be adil, he says. And adil, the Islamic definition of adil and justice, is not so much establishing justice and fairness and equity, but rather he has to be relatively pious to the point where he doesn't commit sins openly. If he commits sins in his private quarters, that's fine. What he engages in his palatial compound, we're not concerned about. But at the very least, don't commit sins openly in public. Then he says, there are some prerequisites which are matters of debate. They're debatable. There's no consensus around them. For instance, that the Khalifa has to be brave. Number two, the Khalifa has to be a mujtahid. He has to have knowledge, alim, right? He says these two things, they're not necessary. They're auxiliary prerequisites of being a Khalifa. Essentially, the things and the attributes that their own khulafa lacked, he says, well, they're not necessary. There's no need for him to be brave. Why? Because bravery is required at a time of battle, war. You need to be, if you're going to be a commander, a general, you have to be brave. You can't run away. You can't escape and end up a few hundred miles in a different direction because you felt that your life was in danger if you're the Khalifa. I mean, that goes without saying. He says, well, no, not necessarily, because the Khalifa could always appoint people who lead those armies into battle, and so he can stay safely at home, surrounded by his wife and kids. And whoever leads the army then has to be brave. As for knowledge, he doesn't need that either, because he can always consult those people who are knowledgeable. So basically, to be a Khalifa comes down to being a male and not be disabled. I mean, it's staggering. Among the inconsistencies and ironies of the PhD thesis is he says that when it comes to picking the Khalifa, there needs to be unanimous consensus. The entire nation. And then he likens this to the democratic parliamentary system that we have in the West. He says, look, Islam said that you need consensus way before the West realized that democracy is a thing and that parliaments should be set up. Islam presented this. But then he confronts the problem that there was never really any consensus when it comes to the Khulafa after the Holy Prophet. And so he says, okay, since we don't have consensus, since not everybody agreed, the majority is sufficient. Then he realizes that even the majority wasn't consulted. It was only about 6 or 8 or 10, less than a dozen people sat together in Saqeefa and appointed the Khalifa. So he says, okay, the Sahaba were there. Okay, not all the Sahaba. But then let's not forget that the Sahaba, they emulate the Holy Prophet. يَسْتَنُّونَ بِسِيرَةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ بِسُنَّةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. And so if not all the Sahaba, but a sizable group of Sahaba get together and they appoint the Khalifa, that's also sufficient. But you called it consensus. By definition, consensus is everybody. Then he says, okay, it's also true that when the first Khalifa was selected, that you didn't have people from outside Medina. If we claim that all Muslims as a collective body, as a nation, have to play a role and have a voice in the selection of the Khalifa, because you're likening it to democratic systems, he says, sure, but the people of Medina are also sufficient. Why? Because Malik ibn Anas says that the people of Medina generally emulated Rasulullah, and so their consensus is binding on all Muslims. And I'm reading all of this and thinking to myself, subhanallah. The Sahaba, because they spent time with Rasulullah, their opinion is binding. But the Ahlul Bayt, who were the family of Rasulullah, not only is their opinion not binding, they are not even consulted. The people of Medina saw Rasulullah, so their consensus is also binding. And the family of Rasulullah have no say in the matter whatsoever. Not even as much as consultants. You see the irony in all of this? Then he says, one of the conditions, one of the prerequisites of a Khalifa has also been mentioned in scholarly works, and that is to be a member of Quraysh. And he said that's exactly what happened. Rasulullah said, Al-Khulafa'u min ba'di, aw al-a'immatu min ba'di, 12 kulluhum min Quraysh. My successors are all members of the tribe of Quraysh. And that's what happened. Abu Bakr was a Qurashi, Umar was a Qurashi, Uthman was a Qurashi. So see, here for the first time, he can actually reconcile between the words and instructions of Rasulullah and historical facts. So he says, you see, we can see this very clearly. And I'm again thinking to myself, subhanallah, what is so special about Quraysh? What is so special about this tribe other than their widespread practice of infanticide against their daughters? What is so special about Quraysh other than the fact that they circumambulated around the majestic sacred house of Allah while being bare naked? There's nothing special about this tribe other than the fact that Rasulullah was from them. So the family of Rasulullah who were the closest to him, his flesh and blood. There's nothing special about them. But anybody from Quraysh should be the successor of Rasulullah. Not his family though. Ultimately, again, as I said, the book is riddled with these astonishing inconsistencies. But the point I want to draw your attention to in the thesis is he says, look, prior to dynastic rule and before Yazid came to power through coercion and force and by the power of the sword, things were okay, things were good. Aside from maybe some cosmetic changes that had to be made here and there, some differences of opinion that were irrelevant, other than that, everything was roses and butterflies and hunky-dory. And so we need to resort and revert back to that model. The model of the first Khulafa al-Rashidun is the one that is the optimum model that we need to emulate. And this is something that's now become mainstream. It's an idea that you hear quite often. But here's my question to you, and I want you to think about this. What did Yazid actually do that was new? What was different about this vile creature? Well, you might say that, and we've heard this from the pulpits, that he used to drink wine. But was he the first to drink wine? Absolutely not. I mean, Muawiyah also drank. Not only did he drink, he even offered it to his guests. Prior to that, other companions were also drinking wine. The second Khalifa is famous. Ibn Qutaybah says in Al-Imama wa Siyasat, this is a Sunni book. I mean, even if the author is not Ibn Qutaybah, it's a 4th century book, and it was without a shadow of doubt not written by a Shia. It's an apologetic, polemical work. Yes, it has some facts in it that are true and that can be used to discredit the other side. But the book itself is an apologetic work. It defends them. And in that book he says that when he was stabbed, the physician was brought to examine him to see whether he's going to survive or not. When the physician examined him, the wounds were too severe. He said, look, give him whatever he wants to have right now. Meaning that he's not going to live, he's going to die. So they said to him, what would you like to drink? He said, an-nabidh. An-nabidh is watered down beer, right? Al-Bukhari mentions that they came to the Khalifa and they told him so and so, and funnily enough, he omits the name. It doesn't say who that person was. Abdul Rahman ibn Auf or whoever it is, because you have to keep the appearance, right? Fulanun yabi'ul khamr. He's selling wine. He's not just drinking it. He's not just keeping it in his cellar. He's selling it out in the open market. So there's nothing new about the fact that Yazid drank. Yes, what was different was that he did it while seated on the pulpit of Rasulullah, and that he would splash it next to that golden bowl. But there was nothing new about him doing it. Or that Yazid didn't pray. Or that he didn't pray on time. Or that he changed and manipulated the way prayers were performed. There's nothing new about that either. Nothing. Anas ibn Malik, companion of Rasulullah, a servant of Rasulullah, is quoted in Al-Bukhari. He says, Wallah, ma a'rifu shay'an mimma kana ala ahdi Rasulillah. What I observed today, and this is in the year 27. This isn't in the time of Imam al-Hussein. This is way early on. 27 years after, this was around, 17 after the death of Rasulullah. So in the time of the 3rd Khalifa, he says that what I observed today, none of it resembles what Rasulullah used to do. They told him, what's salat? What about prayer? Even prayer is not how Rasulullah used to pray it. He said, وَكَيْفَ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَقَدْ ضَيَّعْتُمْ مَا ضَيَّعْتُمْ فِيهَا. Yeah, including salat. Even your prayers are different. The way you do wudu are different. Hudayfa, a companion of Rasulullah, he says, and this is in Sahih Muslim, he says that they did things to us that we had to pray in secret. Explain that to me. Why would a companion of Rasulullah say that in the reign of the first Khulafa, we had to pray in secret? Other than the fact that the way they prayed was so different. It resembled none of how Rasulullah used to pray. Have you ever seen someone pray 2 prayers of Dhuhr and Al-Asr at the same time and the same place, but perform one of them qasr and the other tamam? Have you ever seen that happen? So the quadripartite prayers, as-salatul ruba'iyyah, when you're traveling, has to be cut in half. So you pray only 2 units, 2 ruku' instead of 4. Muawiyah came in, this is in Musnad Ahmad. I'm only referring to their books. In Musnad Ahmad, it says that Muawiyah came to Mecca to perform Hajj. When he was in Mina, now Mina is outside of Mecca. He went to Mina, and while he was camped there for the 3 days, he came out to perform prayers. Salatul Dhuhr, he performed it qasr. Fair enough. When he finished, they came to him. They said to him, Wayhak, woe unto you. Ma a'aba ibn ammika ahadun kama a'abtah. No one has ever insulted your cousin, meaning Uthman, the way you've insulted him. He said, why? What's going on? What did I do wrong? They said to him, Uthman used to pray tamam in Mina. He said, but I saw, listen, Muawiyah said, I saw with my own 2 eyes Rasulullah as well as the first Khalifa and the second Khalifa pray qasr in Mina. They said to him, yes, but this is a scandal. This will make Uthman look bad. فدخل معاوية ثم خرج لصلاة العصر فصلاها تماما. The second salah, he prayed it in full. Why? Because it'll make Uthman look bad. And he was all about defending Uthman and avenging the blood of Uthman and all that sort of stuff. And so he did it. Yazid, the fact that he prayed late or he manipulated the way salah was performed, there was nothing new about that. Nothing. So what was different? Why is it that Imam al-Hussein, Sayyidu Shababi Ahl al-Jannah, says فَعَلَى الْإِسْلَامِ السَّلَامِ إِذِ ابْتُلِيَتِ الْأُمَّةُ بِرَاعٍ مِثْلَ يَزِيدٍ? Why is it that he says that this religion is now done with because Yazid is now the ruler? If Yazid didn't do anything new, what Imam al-Hussein is telling us and what the Ahlul Bayt have consistently reported to us and tried to make us understand is that this individual had been on life support. This religion has been on life support since the day of Saqeefa. It's only now that we have to declare the time of death. This body's been dead for a long time now. It's been dead for a long time. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate. People talk about the savagery of the army of Yazid on the plains of Karbala. You might say, well, that's different. That's unprecedented. That's something that hasn't been observed before. Well, you'd be wrong. The brutality of the day of Ashura, the mercilessness of the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt was nothing new. None of it was new. What was new was that it was directed at Imam al-Hussein as the son of Rasulullah. La yawmaka yawmika ya Aba Abdillah is because what they did on the day of Ashura, they did it to Imam al-Hussein. Otherwise, these very same acts were observed from the day of Saqeefa. Malik ibn Nuwayra is an example, and you've heard his story, and how they went They told them that we're not here to fight. Khalid ibn al-Walid said that, look, you've refused to pay taxes to the new self-proclaimed Khalifa. That's okay. We're only here to take you to him so that you could engage in a civil conversation, have a debate, and if he agrees with your point of view, then so be it. They said, so you're not here to fight? They said, no. It's time for prayers, let's get up and pray. In the middle of salah, they turned against them and killed every last single one of them. They even used their heads to raise the pots and cook meals on them. And then the wife of Malik gets raped all night long, this married, grieving woman. This happened literally in the first year after the death of Rasulullah. This is not the year 61 after Hijrah. This is Malik ibn Nuwayra. Amr ibn al-Hamiq al-Khuza'i, one of the top companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's an individual who gets killed by Muawiyah. The way he was captured was absolutely treacherous. Something that is reminiscent of the actions of the worst and most vile despots. They wanted to get him, they couldn't. Muawiyah had a vendetta against him for his actions in Siffin and how he hurt the army of Muawiyah. And so they couldn't get a hold of him. Eventually, they arrested and began torturing his family members. Just like stories you hear about Saddam and what he used to do. They took his family members. They took women and children, threw them in prison, and they said, if you don't hand yourself over, we're going to kill them. So he simply had to surrender. Then they took him. They killed him. Then they transported his severed head all the way from Iraq to Sham to be handed to Muawiyah. And then that severed head was thrown. His own wife was in prison at the time. They came and threw his severed head into the lap of his poor grieving wife. What they did in Ashura and the aftermath of Ashura was nothing new, except that it was done to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, the son of Rasulullah. You hear, for example, that they prevented the camp of Imam al-Hussein from reaching the water from drinking. But that was already done in Siffin. It was done by Muawiyah. The only difference was that Muawiyah couldn't secure access to the water. Amir al-Mu'mineen came and he said to his companions, "Urwu suyufakum min ad-dima' turwaw min al-ma'." You want water? You want to quench your thirst? You need to quench your swords with the blood of the enemy. Attack them all at once. One ambush, they regained access to the water wells, and Muawiyah couldn't deprive them of water. He couldn't kill them with thirst the way they did to Imam al-Hussein. But they'd done it before. Again, none of it was new. It was all orchestrated according to plan. There was a protocol that they followed, a protocol that was established on the day of Saqeefa. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says in the blessed book of Al-Kafi, he says, حين كتب الكتاب قتل الحسين. Which kitab? The Imam says that accursed treaty that was signed by those 6 individuals who said to each other that this is a treaty, we're going to sign it with our blood, that after the Prophet, Bani Hashim and his family get nothing of what the Prophet left. They don't become khulafa, they don't become imams, they get nothing. And we'll have to kill each and every single one of them. This is before the death of Rasulullah. حين كتب الكتاب قتل الحسين. Imam al-Sadiq says. In fact, if you look at the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they would sometimes say this to their companions and encourage them to say it to others. Yes, brothers and sisters, there's no question that in our religion, in our faith, we have 2 distinctive concepts. One is bara'ah, the other is ida'ah. Bara'ah is to disassociate, yes, hate the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In your heart, amongst yourselves, with your families, with your friends, you have to have bara'ah. أَلَيْسَ الدِّينُ إِلَّا الْحُبُّ وَالْبُغْضُ. The Imams have told us time and again Religion is all that, and inshallah in the upcoming nights we'll explore this concept a little bit more and the practical implications of hubb and bughd. Why it matters so much. Why the Imam says religion is none but love and hatred. And this is part and parcel of our faith. But then there is ida'ah, and ida'ah is those people who try to announce this and broadcast it and try and reach as many people as possible. That's a whole other topic. And that's something that according to some of our traditions is not allowed. But bara'ah is a cornerstone of our faith. Fatemiyah is a cornerstone of our faith because it revolves around bara'ah. Because it bears naked the character and the specific individuals of the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt. It shows you in a manner that is as clear as daylight. There is no ambiguity, there's no bewilderment, there's no confusion of any kind. That's why Fatemiyah and the affliction of Fatima Zahra alayhi salatu wassalam is that brick wall, that concrete wall that once you reach it, there's no way around it. If you're someone who cannot determine what the truth is, what happened after the death of Rasulullah, Fatemiyah will shed light on all of it and make it crystal clear. And that's a fact. If you look at all of the people who have found the light of the Ahlul Bayt and have boarded the ark of salvation, the overwhelming majority of them will say, Fatima, Fatima, Fadak, the sermon, the fact that her rights were usurped. And so the Imams ﷺ would ensure that this message was loud and clear among the followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Al-Kumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi was a poet. He comes to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. He said to him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, I would like to read you some verses of poetry. The Imam said to him, these are important days. This was while the Imam was in Hajj. He said, لَكِنَّهَا فِيكُمْ يَا ابْنَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. These poems aren't about, birds and trees and love and this, that, or the other. They're about you. And when they're about you, they're about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Imam said to him, Hati, now I'd like you to read them to me. Then he invited some of his family members and said, come, Kumayt is about to recite Masa'ib for us. And so Kumayt begins to recite his poetry. And in one line, he says something that suddenly makes Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam burst into tears as well as prayers for him. He says to him that the one who shot the infant of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein on the day of Ashura was one person, yes, but the bow, the arrow was shot on the day of Ashura, but the bow was in the hands of someone else. The arrow was in fact released on the day of Saqeefa. That's when it was released. The Imam suddenly raised his hands in prayers and he said, Allahumma ighfir lil Kumayt ما أسر وما أظهر وما قدم وما أخر وأعطه حتى يرضى. Oh Allah, give Kumayt everything he wants. Give him until he's satisfied. May Allah forgive all of your sins. Allahu Akbar. سهم أتى من جانب السقيفة وقوسه على يد الخليفة. Al-Raghib al-Isfahani says that the day of Ashura wasn't a mishap, it wasn't an accident. It's not that on the day of Ashura there were a group of people who surrounded Imam al-Hussein and suddenly became agitated or angry. And so they brought horses with sharp hooves to the killing pit. That's not what happened. It wasn't a spur of the moment. It wasn't a spontaneous thing. This was a protocol. In fact, Ashura is the organic fruit of the day of Saqeefa. It's the natural, inevitable conclusion of the chain of events that were set on that dreadful and horrible day, the day of Saqeefa. The day of Ashura was only a continuation of that. I'll give you an example from the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen. You don't need to go too far back. The Battle of Jamal is something that unfortunately most people don't know much about. Yes, we know the main individuals involved. We know that it was a battle that took place near Basra. But the details are what reinforce the notion that I'm trying to convey to you. That the savagery and the brutality and the viciousness that we witness on the day of Ashura and for which we will cry forever, these were reflections and reverberations of what happened in the Jamal. First of all, subhanallah, there's a Lebanese diplomat, a highly regarded Christian statesman in Lebanon by the name of Nasri Salhab. This man has over a dozen books, and he has a trilogy called Ala Khuta al-Masih, walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Ala Khuta Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And the third is entitled Ala Khuta Ali. The way a Christian speaks about Ali ibn Abi Talib, brothers and sisters, is often so pure. It's so unadulterated, isn't it? It's not bogged down with theological baggage. They don't feel the incessant need to defend anybody and to try and cover their tracks and brush their crimes under the carpet, right? And so when they speak freely, which is what makes their writing so beautiful and so real. He says in his book that Ali ibn Abi Talib was a strange character. Number one, he says Ali was known for his forgiveness more than he was known for his warrior qualities. He forgave his own enemies. You see, forgiving your friend is not hard because he's your friend. But to forgive your sworn enemy and someone who, had they had the upper hand, they would spill your blood, now that's a big deal. So he says, وَمَا كَانَ عَلِيٌّ لِيَجْهَلْ. It's not that Ali lacked awareness. أنه لو ظفر به عدوه, that if his enemies had gained the upper hand and had they been victorious against him, لقتلوه ولقطعوا أوصاله ومثلوا به. Says Ali knew exactly what these people were made of. That if they had conquered Ali, if they had defeated Ali, they would not only have killed him, they would have mutilated him. And yet he forgave them. Another Sunni Tunisian author by the name of Ubaid Khalifi, he has a book called Ali ibn Abi Talib fi al-Mikhyal al-Islami al-Arabi. Ali in the collective Islamic and Arabian imagination. He says Ali is an enigmatic personality. فَهُوَ الْبَطَلُ الْوَاحِدُ الْمُتَعَدِّدُ, he says. Listen carefully to his words. He says Ali was a singular man, unique in every respect, and yet he was a multiplicity in and of himself. Ali ibn Abi Talib was one person, and yet he combined these qualities within him that were contradictory, that you can't combine in one person. جُمِعَتْ فِي صِفَاتِكَ الْأَضْدَادُ فلهذا عزت لك الأنداد زاهد حاكم حليم شجاع ناسك فاتك فقير جواد شيم. The poet says that if you look at Ali ibn Abi Talib, the reason he is so unique, the reason that he has no equal and no parallel, is because how could you have someone who is at the very peak of bravery and yet be the most merciful as well? Bravery, by definition, is a quality that for you to acquire it, you need to have a certain degree of brutality. You need to be heartless. And so, how is it that Ali was the bravest man and the most merciful man? How is it that Ali ibn Abi Talib was this person who would fall unconscious as he prayed to Allah out of fear of the fire of hell, and yet look at him on the battlefield, not a trace of fear or terror? How does that happen? And so, this Tunisian author, he says in his book that you have these contrasting aspects to the personality of Amir al-Mu'mineen and Jamal. The reason I'm saying all of this is I want to get to the other side. I want to talk to you about what the adversaries of Ali ibn Abi Talib did, and show you that what you found happening on the plains of Karbala was nothing new. He says Amir al-Mu'mineen had two contradictory aspects to his personality. On the one hand, Aliyun al-Shuja', Ali the brave. He says after 25 years, when the sword of Ali ibn Abi Talib had not been moved once and was put back into its sheath and was attracting dust, everyone expected Ali to be worn out. A quarter of a century, Ali had not engaged in any battle. And so now on the plains of Basra, when he's fighting the army of the camel, Ali ibn Abi Talib won't be able to, he won't be at his peak performance, let's say. And yet when he came to the battle, everyone was running away from him. First thing he did was he invited Zubayr for a conversation. When Zubayr was called out by Amir al-Mu'mineen, his wife, she was the sister of Aisha. His wife began crying and wailing. They said to her, "What's wrong with you?" She said, "I know. Ali calls anybody, that person comes back in a body bag. My husband's as good as dead." They said to her, no, don't worry. Ali ibn Abi Talib is riding on the camel of Rasulullah. Ali ibn Abi Talib hasn't worn his shield and his armor. He's not here to fight, he's here to talk. And so she began laughing out loud that finally there's a reason for hope that her husband's actually going to make it. Ubayd Khalifi, the Tunisian author, says that on the one hand, Ali ibn Abi Talib showed that even though his sword was now dusty after a quarter of a century of not being used, but he showed that the arm, the hand that held that sword was Yadullah. And that it wasn't so much the sword of Ali, it was Ali himself, his character. He was still the great warrior that had saved Islam on multiple occasions in Badr and Khaybar and Khandaq and others. Ali ibn Abi Talib was still Aliyun al-Shuja'. But on the other hand, he says, Ali was Aliyun al-Sabur. Why? The fact that he forgave and forgave and forgave. A couple of examples. When the dust had settled, the battle had ended, Amir al-Mu'mineen had gained victory. They were walking and they came across all the women that had come with the army of the camel. And so as Amir al-Mu'mineen and his troops were passing these women, they started cursing Ali ibn Abi Talib. They hurled vulgar profanities in his direction. They insulted him. Immediately, this enrages you, naturally. Amir al-Mu'mineen looked at his companions. He said, "Don't do anything to them. Leave them alone. These women are bereaved. They're grieving for their men. Leave them alone." Musa ibn Talha, you all know who Talha is. Talha was one of the chief architects of the camel. His son Musa participated in the battle. He killed members of the companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen. They took him as a prisoner. He knew that he wasn't going to make it, that the wrath of Ali ibn Abi Talib would be poured down upon him. He knew he was going to get killed for his part and his father's part. So when they called his name, he started to shiver. They took him to Amir al-Mu'mineen. The Imam simply said this to him. He said, "Do you give a commitment that you will not shed the blood of Muslims anymore?" He said, "Yes." He said, "You're free to go." Marwan al-Wazagh, Amir al-Mu'mineen, forgave him. The leader of the army forgave her. Aliyun al-Shuja', Aliyun al-Sabur. How do you reconcile all of these? This is Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now let's take a look at the other side. The Battle of the Camel began like this. 10,000 armed soldiers. I'll summarize the events of the battle in a few minutes. 10,000 people went to Basra. Basra was a fortified city, as cities were back then. The governor of Basra was Uthman ibn Hunayf, who was appointed by Amir al-Mu'mineen, a good man. When he noticed 10,000 people at his doorstep, he sent people to speak to them. And they said to them, what do you want to do here? They said, no, we're not here to fight. We're simply coming to Basra. And we have no intention of fighting anyone or spilling any blood. Uthman ibn Hunayf said, if that is the case, and as long as you don't fight, we have no problems with you. You're welcome to come in. They came in, the first thing they did was they ambushed the governor's mansion, the government house. They went there. The camel rider told her troops, she said, kill Uthman ibn Hunayf. They said to her, hang on a second. Uthman is a tribal chief. If we kill him, his tribe, who are mostly stationed in Medina, they will want revenge. And they will never stop until they kill each and every last one of us. This is not a wise decision. She said, okay, if that's the case, then beat him senseless and shave his beard to disgrace him. This old man, imagine. So even when she decided not to kill someone, it was because of fear of the consequences. It wasn't that it was for Allah. They beat the poor guy, they tortured him, they shaved his beard, they sent him to Amir al-Mu'mineen. Not only that, but there were 40 guardians who protected the treasury, Baytul Mal. 10,000 people ambushing 40 individuals, they mutilated them. They killed them in the most macabre manner. Every last single one. Imagine. Then they went to the treasury. Now, the treasury is essentially this very large safe where the money is not paper or plastic, it's gold and silver. Right? It's jewels. It's expensive items that you can trade for anything. So they stormed the treasury and they stole as much of it as they could. They distributed among the troops. And eventually they realized that there's still a lot left. This was Basra. Basra was half of today's Iraq. It was half of Iran. And so the amount of money in the treasury was staggering. They still ended up with quite a substantial amount. This moment, brothers and sisters, is when you say goodbye to the Jamal. This is when you realize that the Battle of Jamal and the ideals and the slogans of the people who waged that oppressive war against Amir al-Mu'mineen was nothing but a ridiculous farce. When they finished giving out some of the, or part of the treasury to their troops, they then said to each other, they looked at each other, those three, the camel rider, Talha Zubayr, they said, we're going to have to put 3 locks on this door now. And so their troops started saying, hang on a second. These are our leaders. These are people who claim to be related to Rasulullah. They don't even trust each other. Let's put 3 locks and each one of us gets 1 key. Oh, the disgrace. Oh, the shame. There's no honor among thieves. And so they put the 3 locks. Then, after this whole incident, the killing of the 40 guardians, when news of their death reached Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Imam cried out loud for them. Imagine, these were people who were handpicked by Ali ibn Abi Talib, the most trustworthy individuals to look after the safe, to look after the money that belongs to the Muslims. 40 of them were massacred. Then 700 people from among the partisans and the supporters of Amir al-Mu'mineen, they mobilized in Basra, they attacked the army. Again, 10,000 people and 700 on this side, there's really no chance. So they took them. These are written in the works of Tabari, in the works of Dhahabi, in the works of Ibn Kathir. This is not from Kafi and Bihar. When these 700 people came and they clashed with the army of the camel. They then took them as prisoners. Have you ever seen footage and videos of the Spiker massacre, brothers and sisters? Have you seen how they grab every single one of these cadets and they shoot them in the head and throw them in the river? That's exactly how they killed 700 Shia of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Zubayr took the sword and he was killing them one after the other. In other words, they killed prisoners. Prisoners. After that, they were so ecstatic, they were so hysterical and mad and drunk with power and pride that they sent a message back to Medina. One of the wives of Rasulullah, one of the partners, she heard that Ali ibn Abi Talib was headed towards Basra, but that Basra was now under the full control of the camel rider, and that there was almost no hope for Amir al-Mu'mineen. She gathered her maids and her women, and she asked them to dance and sing and say things that I can't even translate to you. Mal khabaru, mal khabar. Then they said, what's happening? Whether Ali advances or retreats, we're going to take him and we're going to kill him the way we kill a certain animal. I don't want to mention it. Nasri Salhab says, Ali knew when he was forgiving all of these people. Marwan, you know what Marwan did in Jamal? Marwan was standing on a hill. He was shooting one arrow in the direction of the army of Amir al-Mu'mineen and another arrow in the direction of the army of the camel rider. Someone came to him and said to him, you imbecile, what do you think you're doing? He said, look, if I shoot the followers of Ali, I win. And if I shoot the people on the other side, well, I also win. Amir al-Mu'mineen said that by God, had Talha and Zubayr gained the upper hand, the first person who would be killed at the hand of the other. There was no trust between them, no honor between them, nothing. So yeah, they started singing that we're going to kill Ali the way a certain animal that has a long neck, that's how we're going to kill him. And this, by the way, was something that was used in an attempt to insult Amir al-Mu'mineen on more than one occasion. Muawiyah ibn Abi al-Hadid mentions this. He says that Muawiyah sent a letter to Amir al-Mu'mineen. Listen to this. He said to him that you were pulled after, you never gave your allegiance willingly after the death of Rasulullah, which is an important and critical admission. Because all the people who try to tell you that it was hunky-dory after the death of the Prophet, that they all got together and they had biscuits and tea and they decided that, oh, this person has to be Khalifa, and that Amir al-Mu'mineen named his son after this guy and that guy. See, this is inconsistent. Muawiyah says to Amir al-Mu'mineen that you never gave your allegiance until you were pulled kal jamal al-makhshush. Makhshush means they would drill a hole in the nose of the camel and they would put a rope in it and pull him. So they pulled you like that. And that you hated the khulafa. Listen to what Amir al-Mu'mineen said to him. He said to him, you wanted to make me cry, but you made me laugh. You wanted to insult me, but really you praised me. You wanted to expose me, but you exposed none other than yourself. First of all, what did the khulafa have that would make me jealous of them? And if I hated them, the Imam doesn't say, no, I didn't. He said, if I hated them, well, what's it to you? You have nothing to gain from this. As for the fact that you say they pulled me like a camel, the Imam said, subhanallah, it's not a flaw when someone is oppressed as long as they maintain their faith in Allah and have no doubt in their heart. I was oppressed, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. And all of this proves, it's a confession by Muawiyah that what happened after Rasulullah was nothing short of savagery as well. So back to the Jamal. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam chose not to begin the war. Brothers and sisters, here's a moral lesson for all of us. Ibn Abi al-Hadid says that one of the features of a Shia of Ali is that they never assault the other. They never begin a conflict. They never begin a war. This is one of the features observed among not just the Ahlul Bayt, but also their followers. What are the features that a Shia is supposed to have? A Shia is kathiru salat. Historically, that's how they identified a Shia. If they saw someone in Masjid al-Kufa praying too much, they would say, he must be a Rafidi. A Shia is kathiru salat. A Shia la yakdhib, our traditions tell us. One of our followers would never lie, not even once. Be truthful, be honest, be brave. It's a cop-out. It's a disgrace. It's a sign of being a coward when someone has to lie. Say the truth and don't be afraid and face the consequences. A Shia never lies. A Shia is trustworthy. When you're entrusted with something, you always honor that trust and you fulfill it. These are some of the features of a Shia of Ali ibn Abi Talib. But Ibn Abi al-Hadid says that one of their features was just like their leader and their commander. They never initiated a war. Amir al-Mu'mineen could have done that. He had the upper hand. Imam al-Hussein could have done that in Karbala. And again, he would have gained an edge. Remember, Imam al-Hussein could have launched the battle in the middle of the night in the pitch black darkness. And he could have actually gained some advances in that war. But he chose not to. إني أكره أن أبدأهم بقتال, the Imam declared. I would hate to begin the war. Even though it's a war. We know what they're going to do to us. We know what their objective is. And yet, the Imams would never start the war. Amir al-Mu'mineen refused. Instead, this is what he did. Salamullahi alayki ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Wallahi, brothers and sisters, the reason that a Christian would dissolve in the love of Ali when they read his history is because they contrast and compare him with everybody else and they see qualities that are unique in every respect. Amir al-Mu'mineen came. He said, I'm looking for someone, a volunteer, to go and recite the Quran to them. Again, Nasri Salhab. Remember the Lebanese Christian diplomat? He was the ambassador ambassador of Lebanon to the Vatican. And he received one of the highest honors from the Pope at the time. This man, Nasri Salhab, he says in his book, again speaking ala khuta Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says Ali ibn Abi Talib, he would always resort to the Quran. He would always begin every battle with recitations of the Holy Quran. He said, yes, Muawiyah also resorted to the Quran, but there's a big difference. Muawiyah resorted to it at the end and used it to shield himself from getting killed. Whereas Ali recited the Quran to guide people and to limit the number of dead in the battle. Maybe, just maybe, I could guide someone. Just like Imam al-Hussein, just like other members of the Ahlul Bayt, their intention was to guide. Even if I can guide 5 people, it's enough. I've done my job. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, I'm looking for a volunteer. And I'm addressing all the youth in the audience. May Allah bless every single one of you for commemorating the tragedy that gave way to every subsequent calamity. For being here listening to the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. He said, I'm looking for a volunteer, but I want him to go and recite the Quran in the middle of the battlefield, and he will be killed. However, inni adminu lahu ala Allah al-jannah. I guarantee that he's going to enter paradise. They say that they shot Imam al-Hussein with arrows and spears while he was praying in Karbala. They did the same thing in this battle, in Jamal. The exact same thing. So nobody got up. Imagine the Imam telling you that you're going to get killed right now. No one stood up, no one volunteered. This young man, he was only 18 years old. Remember his name. His name was Muslim al-Juhani bin Bani Qais. Muslim al-Juhani, he was 18 years old. He got up. He said, Ana laha ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, I'll do it. The Imam looked away. In other words, I'm not looking for someone this young. Let's give a chance to others. Who would get up? Who would volunteer to recite the Quran? وَإِنِّي أَضْمِنُ لَهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْجَنَّةِ. The same young man stood up. He said, I'll do it, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. You see, the only way you could actually reach this stage, this point, when you're given the option and you seize the chance, is if your life revolves around the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Loyalty to Ali ibn Abi Talib and a commitment to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If your life revolved around these two axes, when the moment comes, you shine the way Muslim al-Juhani shined. The Imam said, sit down. Let's try this one more time. Who would go and recite the Quran? He will be killed, but I guarantee paradise for him. The same young person stood up. The Imam said to him, go. He proceeded towards the battlefield. He stood in the middle with the enemy in front of him, the army of Amir al-Mu'mineen behind him. He opened the Quran and began reciting, began reading from the book of Allah. What does the camel rider say? She said, أَشْجِرُوهُ بِالرِّمَاحِ قَبَّحَهُ اللَّهُ. I want you to attack him with your spears and make him look like a bunch of trees. فَهَجَمُوا عَلَيْهِ. They attacked him. Allahu Akbar. You think what happened in Karbala was unique? It wasn't. They killed a young man for reciting the Quran. Then his mother went to him. She took his body, and other Muslims, other companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen helped her. They brought the body back to the camp. The mother started crying and grieving over her son. She said, بُنَيَّ قَتَلُوكَ وَأَنْتَ تَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمُ الْقُرْآنَ. Look at what they did to you. Nothing, brothers and sisters, about Karbala was unique. We've seen it before. And it was all launched on the day of Saqeefa. The snowball began then. Which is why Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says that yes, لا يوم كيوم أبي عبد الله الحسين. There's no day like the day of Ashura, but the day they ambushed the house of Fatima Zahra and the day they killed the Muhsin was an even greater calamity than the day of Ashura. It was an even greater calamity. Why? Because it paved the way. Because it began this causal chain of events that led to the bloodbath, the unspeakable crimes of the day of Ashura. What Fatima Zahra went through. Sallallahu alayki ya mawlati ya Fatima Zahra. You have an 18-year-old daughter of Rasulullah who is grieving for the loss of her father. This young boy says to her, remember she used to go to Uhud every Monday and every Thursday. Fatima Zahra would leave Medina and go all the way to Jibal Uhud, which is a fair distance from Medina, and cry over there. Why? So she wouldn't be disturbed, so they wouldn't tell her that you're disturbing us. When she went to the grave of Rasulullah, they were annoyed and bothered. They said to Ali ibn Abi Talib, make her stop. Allahu Akbar. When someone's grieving, even if it's not the daughter of Rasulullah, someone's grieving, you try and relieve that grief. You try to help them. You try to comfort them. And this is what they did to Fatima, that she would have to go to Uhud and cry there. This young boy approaches her. He says to her, Ya binta Rasulullah, why do I see you crying like this? فَقَدْ قَطَّعْتِ نِيَاطْ قَلْبِي. You have torn the tendons in my heart. Ya binta Rasulullah, the tendons. Why is it that you cry like this? She said, لِفَقْدِ النَّبِيِّ وَظُلْمِ الْوَصِيِّ. For losing my father and for the oppression of Ali ibn Abi Talib and what they did to him. You've all heard the story. Those of you who understand what I'm telling you, you've all heard that when Amir al-Mu'mineen came to Rasulullah and proposed to Fatima Zahra, the Holy Prophet said to him, Ya Ali, you're about to get married. You need to buy some things for your home. You need to give a dowry. What do you have to offer? Amir al-Mu'mineen said, I have my sword and my horse and my shield. Rasulullah said to him, as for your sword and your horse, you need them for battle. But as for your shield, you won't be needing that anymore. You have someone to shield you now. Every single time Amir al-Mu'mineen shielded Rasulullah in battle with his chest and his neck and his back and his sides. Well, now it's time for the debt to be repaid. Rasulullah wants to compensate Amir al-Mu'mineen. You're now getting married to someone who will shield you with her life, O Ali. You won't be needing that shield anymore. For the next 14 nights after the death of Rasulullah, Fatima would go door to door. بِأَبِي أَنْتِ وَأُمِّي يَا Fatima. Why is it that the daughter of Rasulullah has to go door to door and speak to the companions? My husband was oppressed. They took his right. Door to door. And they shut their doors in her face. One would say, it's too late. I already gave my allegiance. The other would say, please leave my house. I don't want to be seen near you. 40 nights, 40 days, Fatima did all she could. They realized Fatima was a danger to their rule. Fatima had to go. Fatima was breaking the unity that they had created around this idol, around this Khalifa. Fatima, they had no choice but to completely obliterate her from the face of the earth. And so what do? They send a contingent at first. They go to the house. They start shouting. Nobody knocked on the door of Fatima. Nobody asked for permission to enter. They simply shouted. Fatima Zahra went to the door to respond to them, to shield Ali ibn Abi Talib. Why? Because Fatima has some sanctity, some measure of respect. Every Muslim had seen Rasulullah. Whenever Fatima would enter upon him, the Prophet would stand up from his seat. He would approach her. He would kiss her hand. He would have her sit where he was sitting. As a child, Rasulullah did this to her. Everyone had heard Rasulullah say, Fatima bad'atun minni, man adhaha faqad adhani. فاطمة سيدة نساء أهل الجنة فاطمة روحي التي بين جنبي. They had all heard these things, they had seen these things. Fatima was using whatever measure of honor and respect and sanctity she might have had in their cold stone hearts to shield Ali ibn Abi Talib. She went to the door. They threatened her. They said that we're going to burn down your house. Allahu Akbar. Fatima Zahra said, how dare you? Have you no shame? She reminded them of Rasulullah. She said, I am grieving. I am crying for my father. I am pregnant with a child, and this is what you do to me. The first group, they say, went back crying. Then another group was sent. They said these people were too timid. We need to send a group that have hearts that are made of stone this time. They went, they engaged, they spoke to Fatima. Fatima reminded them one more time. This time they also went back crying. Then the second said, I have to go. It seems that I need to step in. He went, وَهُوَ يَحْمِلُ حَطَبًا. He was carrying, this time he didn't even threaten. He had a piece of wood that was already alight with fire. He headed towards the house of Fatima Zahra. They told him the house has people in it. One of those people is Fatima. He responded by saying, I don't care. It doesn't matter who's inside the house. He went to the door. Fatima came behind the door. He says in a letter addressed to Muawiyah, his cohort, he said, فَلَمَّا أَحْسَسْتُ بِهَا وَرَاءَ الْبَابِ. I pushed it firstly to see whether the door was obstructed, whether there was something behind it. when I felt that Fatima was behind the door, فركلت الباب. أجرك الله يا صاحب الزمان. فمذ رأوها عصروها عصره، كادت وربي أن تموت حسره. Fatima Zahra, she screamed. She only said one thing. She said, أبتاه يا رسول الله أهكذا يفعل بحبيبتك. Look at what they're doing to your sweetheart. Allahu Akbar. Fatima Zahra never complained to Amir al-Mu'mineen. She never even said once. They say that when Amir al-Mu'mineen came to her, when she had already died, the Imam removed the veil. He saw the hand of Fatima resting on her right cheek, so Ali wouldn't have to see the bruises on her face. Fatima only complained to Rasulullah. She said, أهكذا يفعل بحبيبتك. There was a lesson to learn here. The lesson was that when you're at your darkest hour, who do you turn to? You turn to Rasulullah. You send your salam to Rasulullah. Who learned this lesson? It was Zainab who witnessed it. Which is why in the killing pit on the day of Ashura, she looked in the direction of Medina. Jeddah, Ya Rasul Allah, Salla alayka maliku as-sama, Hada Husaynuka bil-ara, Murammalun bid-dima, Maslubu al-imamati wal-rida. This is your little Hussein, O Rasulullah. He's drenched in his blood. He's stripped of his shirt. Madbuhun min al-qafa. He was slaughtered from the back. And there is another thing I wish to tell you, Ya Rasulullah. What is it, Ya al-Masa'ib? Wa haula banatuka sabaya. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج والعافية والنصر. اجعلنا من أنصاره وأعوانه وشيعته والمستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا. اللهم ارزقنا في الدنيا زيارة الحسين وفي الآخرة شفاعة الحسين. ثبتنا على ولاية أمير المؤمنين. اللهم لا تفرق بيننا وبين آل محمد طرفة عين أبدا. إلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات ومن مات من هذا الجمع نهدي لهم ثواب سورة المباركة الفاتحة تسبقها الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.